Okay, hi everyone. Can you raise your hand if you can hear me clearly? So there's a raise hand button. Awesome. Wow, you can also physically raise your hand. That's fine. That's sort of the low-tech way. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. I am going to get started. People will be joining in late. Some co-hosts who can be admitting them. Not expecting 114 people to the journal club, but it's great. I think the crisis, as bad as it is also bringing people together in new ways, and I think that's exciting. It's particularly exciting for the work that we're doing. Not talking to enough people in our research. Yeah, I just wanted to give you an introduction to my paper with Daryl Fournier, who is also here, and Maya Honig, who I believe is not here. And I'm just trying to keep it informal, just saying that I'm speaking to my lab rather than the entire world. To keep the proceedings smooth, I'm not going to allow anybody to while I speak, so there's not going to be any interruptions, but I will unmute everybody at some point, and at that point I will also start reading the chat. So if you have any questions, I would suggest that you save them up for then. So just be ready to copy paste them into the chat window. That seems like a good procedure. I'm also not going to speak for the entire hour because I myself cannot keep don't have an attention span that long. So I think I'll just give sort of a high-level overview, and then we can get a discussion started. You can ask more specific questions if you have to. All right. So the background of it is that Dara and I both had a great interest in working memory. And we've both done many papers on that topic, and we were at some point involved in this slots versus reuse versus debate, but this is not directly about that. So this paper combines two themes. So one is, what do you really use working memory for? Right. So one popular paradigm that Darren and I have both used is where you remember stimulus feature and then you report it after a delay. That's fine. That's a great way to test working memory and capacity limitations and all of that. But if you think about how working memory gets used in the real world, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So in the paper, we give the example of trying to cross a street where you look to your left and you look to your right, and then that means that you have to store some of the information about cars in your working memory, about the positions and the velocities of those cars. Now, it's not that you're going to report the positions and velocities of the cars. It's going to that you use that information in order to decide whether to cross safely, where you can cross, right? And what also goes into the decision is the cost and the benefits of the actions, right? So you risk injury if you cross in a dangerous situation, so would be making it to your destination faster, right? So that's a cost benefits analysis. First idea of this paper, we put a reward-based decision after the working memory stage, right? So we are deciding that we use their working memories for a subsequent reward-based decision. And so the question is then, how do people integrate that the information from working memory into that decision? Second topic of the paper is encoding in working memory. So if you just think about the neuroscience literature on working memory, the emphasis has been on like attractor models that remember in a neural population a point estimate of the stimulus, right? So then if the stimulus was a red color, the population could encode a color that's similar to retain that over the delay period. Now that's already great, but we also know from perception that in many situations, it's important to just know more than a point estimate decisions. Right? In particular, we'll want to use uncertainty in many situations. So a very important that has shown is Q combination, where you have two Qs that have two different levels of reliability or uncertainty, and you have to combine them. Now, in working memory, it's much less clear whether and how uncertainty is used. So there has been some really interesting work by Frank Tong and Rosanne Rademacher. Rosanne was the first author, where people would report their confidence associated with the working memory, and then the confidence rating was associated with their the error. It was correlated with error. We have done some work ourselves where people do a change detection task, and uncertainty actually plays a role in making good change detection decisions. So in the car example, you can also imagine that it plays a role. Let's say it's dark and it's the viewing condition is not very good. That I also have to disable annotations. So people are making annotations right now. Maybe one of my co-hosts can see how we can disable that. I should have done that. I forgot to do that. Otherwise, I can try that myself really quick. Yeah, right now I cannot immediately see it. Otherwise I see if I can make Conrad a co-host, and then he will fix all our problems, right? Conrad, you're now co-host. In the car example, for example, if your viewing experiences are good, and you might have some idea of the speed of the car, but it comes with a lot of uncertainty. And then given the same estimate, the same best estimate of the speed of the car, you might still decide not to cross the road. So much uncertainty about it. Maybe the car is going much faster than you think it is. Okay, so this paper combines those two themes: working with a reward-based decision, and then trying to get at storing whether uncertainty is stored working memory. And you can think of a third theme, perhaps, which is related to the uncertainty theme, which is how prior information gets combined with the uncertainty associated working memory. So we also manipulate the prior, and that's in large extent, to a large extent, in order to probe the effect of memory uncertainty on decisions. So I'm scrolling down to the delay. So you see 4 colors, and you have to remember them while fixating. And then after a period of 1 second, you see one of the locations highlighted. That's the thick white circle. And then along with this white, you see this color wheel. So at that point, you're going to report the color that you remember. So in this case, there's this brownish color. So that little tick mark can be rotated so that you can click on the color that you believe it was. So far, this is a standard estimation task. We're already doing that in 2004. But here's a new interesting thing, which is the reward-based decision. So after you've set that color and you've submitted it, then you're allowed an arc. And the arc can vary in and your purpose is to capture the true color with your arc. You only get rewarded if you do so successfully. So if the true color falls outside the arc, then you don't get any points. So in this last panel, you see that the correct color with the black tick mark does get captured by the arc. Now, here's the twist. You cannot set the size of the arc arbitrarily large without penalty. So the maximum number of points that you can get is 100, but then every little bit that you increase the size of the arc, you earn fewer points if successful. Right? So it's a linear that at some point you just get no points at all anymore. I believe that was at 180 degrees. So there's a penalty. If you're really certain about the color that you remembered, you want to set a small arc because then you can add n points. But if you're not very certain, then you want to set a wider arc because at least you have a chance to get it right. Can you raise your hand if that logic makes sense to you? Awesome, great. You guys. So in this case, it's important for people to actually keep track of how uncertain they are about their memory. Right. So then let's see how we're going to think about this process theoretically. So that's in panel B. So panel B starts with an encoding model and ends with a decision model. So this is in the good tradition of perceptual psychophysics, I would say. Here the encoding model is a so-called variable precision model. Who has heard of the variable precision model? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so a couple of people, but everybody. So a variable precision model is an encoding model of working memory that Daryl and I independently published in 2012. And the idea here is that the precision of your working memory varies due to a variety of factors. Some of them are stimulus related, some of them attention related. There might be stochasticity in the spike rates, but you cannot count on the precision of your working memory to be the same across items and across trials. So in a display such as the one in A, you wouldn't expect each of these items to be encoded with the same level of noise or precision. Right? So in the blue box in B, you see the stimulus. Then that's corrupted by encoding noise. That's our way of saying that memories are not perfect. So then that gives rise to memory. But the level of encoding noise is set by encoding precision. And encoding, if you're aware of your encoding precision, then that is a measure of uncertainty associated with your memory. Right? So pretty much it is that you have fluctuations in the quality which you encode memory, and to some extent you might be aware of those fluctuations and be able to use that information for subsequent decisions. Right? So in this case, the uncertainty can come from many different sources. It could be stimulus related, that you just have fewer neurons to encode a certain color, for example. Also, it could be due to internal fluctuations that are very hard to directly measure, such as attentional fluctuations. Okay, and for example, shifts in covert attention would introduce fluctuations in precision and therefore fluctuations in uncertainty. Now, I make a distinction between precision because precision is to me intrinsically a part of the encoding model, whereas uncertainty already starts talking about the observer. So the observer has beliefs about the stimulus, and those beliefs get expressed in terms of one of the aspects of those beliefs is uncertainty. All right, so then we go into the decision model. Right, so if you are a Bayesian observer, what you would like to do is you would use your noisy memory and combine it with prior information. Right? The prior beliefs come from the stimulus distribution. So that's this little set of arrows at the bottom here. Now, the stimulus distribution that we used was one. So it was either uniform distribution or a circular Gaussian distribution. That's also called distribution. So I'm going to very quickly share with you the procedure we are being people on the stimulus distribution. So you should see a different browser, a different window now. So this is in the supplement. So this stimulus distribution training, Maya really did of work here about the stimulus distribution. So one was exposure to samples. So what you see here, those little circles with histograms around them. All those histograms build up as this participant, and those represent the samples from distribution. Right. So if you're in a session, so this was session by session. So if you are in a session where the stimulus distribution was uniform, then you would see the histogram pretty much covering the entire circle. If it was a von Mises session, then the colors would be clustered around a particular color with some width, right? So in this particular example, it would be around purple. Now, this varied from participant to participant, so this was not always purple. Now, in addition to that, you would all the samples distribution for the von Mises session. So you see that here in the in this panel with a graphical representation of that distribution again. Because the von Mises distribution is particularly hard to learn, you have to learn the width and the mean of that distribution. So then we try to reinforce knowledge of the stimulus distribution by doing a two alternative first choice quiz every 75 trials. So subjects had to choose which of the two sides had the distribution that was currently being used in the session, right? So then they would click on the left side of the screen, one of them representing samples from the correct distribution. And then they had to achieve a minimum score in order to continue. So the next part was actually a test where they had to set the mean and the variance of the color distribution through by moving the mouse right and left for the mean and up and down for the variance. So this is actually pretty cool. This is almost like a video game. I need to do this experiment. But you actually see the entire field of little color dots change as you change the mean and the variance of the color distribution. And then you would try to match it as close as possible. Right? So then we would, they have to match it and then if they got feedback on that as well. Okay, so then this is the procedures that we went through to train people on the stimulus distributions. I'm now going to switch back to the original window. Okay. So, sorry, I had that something went wrong with there. I'm going to try that again. New share, that one. Okay. If you hear noises in the background, that's my 2-year-old trying to enter in the door, but I locked the door because otherwise he is going to be the Zoom over. So stimulus distribution, prior belief plays a role in posterior. Now, so posterior combines in memory with the prior belief. And what you do then is your posterior is going to be strongly influenced by the prior if your memory uncertainty is high, and it's going to be weakly influenced by the prior if the memory uncertainty is low. Okay, that's similar to perception. All right, so now you have a posterior. So your posterior represents your belief about that was in the marked location based on both your noisy memory and your prior beliefs. So based on that, in the model, you would produce an estimate. So you would click on a particular color and you would produce an arc size. So the interesting part here is how you would use the arc size, because we are using a utility model for that. So the idea here is that if you have a certain belief distribution of the colors, then you can calculate the expected reward that you would earn if you set your arc length to a particular value. Right. So typically, if the utility has an inverse U-shape, because if you set your arc too small, you risk completely missing the correct answer. Whereas if you set your arc too large, you will be certain to get the right answer, but you will have very few points. Right? So the peak is going to be somewhere in the middle. And we are assuming that the observers are doing a noisy readout of noisy optimization of expected utility in order to set arc size. Right? So they, in setting, they would balance certainty from associated with their memory, theirs, and the learned reward function, the one that's linearly decreasing as you increase the arc size. Okay? Can you raise your hand if you're still with me? Awesome, great, cool. Good, so that's the process, and that's the experiment, that's the model. The histogram of errors for both conditions, the uniform and the von Mises, they both look reasonable. They also slightly differ, but by itself that doesn't mean very much. Here you see the histogram of arc sizes. Also, reasonable people set arcs that are sort of around 30, 40 degrees. Occasionally, they set much narrower arcs, and there's a long tail. So on some trials, they set very, very large arcs. This is a correlation between the error on for the estimation and then the arc size. So what you would expect to see is that they are strongly correlated, and they are. So as more on trials where people set a large arc size, presumably indicating higher uncertainty, they also turn out to be more off on average. Right? So that's the trend that you would expect. Now, D is an important part. So it's a bit technical, but it's important. So Bay and Flombaum have shown that a lot of variability in precision can already arise from in the stimulus. Just different colors are associated with different levels of precision. Right? And similar things can be found in orientation and in other stimulus dimensions. So we are interested in to what extent the error arc size correlation, the one in C, is driven by this stimulus variable. So what we did for that is a shuffle analysis where we grouped trials together that had a very similar color. But then we did a shuffle within that small group, within a small group of trials property, so that you would decouple the error from the arc size group. And then we would measure the correlation again. So what you see then in the yellow is the stimulus color is a null distribution that you would get that way, with the whiskers indicating, I think, the 95 percentiles. So then what you see here is that the observed arc size correlation, error arc size correlation, is much higher than the one that you would expect based on stimulus score. In fact, based on stimulus score, in our hands, you wouldn't expect much of a correlation here. We didn't just do this control for stimulus color. We also did it for the dispersion of colors within a display, which is something that Tim Brady and others have reported before, and the distance to the closest color, the distance to the most similar color in the display, whether that would be the determining factor for the correlation, and none of that could really account for this correlation. So what this suggests to us is that this correlation is driven at least to a large extent by internal fluctuations in precision. Now, where those exactly come from, we're not very committal about them, but they are not trivially explained by stimulus-related properties. Okay. So now we're going to go to the fit of the model. So the known model is not a model that's known. It's a model in which the observer knows everything there is to know about encoding precision, and so that means that their uncertainty is tightly linked to encoding precision. Okay, so then they are sort of ideal observers down from there on, right? So their input is noisy, but they know how noisy their input is, and they can use the associated measure of uncertainty in the decision stage. That fits these data well. Now, we also compare this. So the fits the data well means that it accounts for the histogram of errors, the histogram of arc sizes, and the correlation between error and arc size in the uniform condition. I'm going to get to the vomesis later. Now we also compare to other models. So this is a cartoon that indicates what the observer knows about their own memory uncertainty, or about their own memory precision, I should say. Right? So memory precision or encoding noise is on the x-axis. So then the known model is where pretty much uncertainty tracks the noise. Right? So you have, let's say, a sigma parameter for the noise, and that sigma is not always the same, but whatever it is, the observer knows what it is and takes it into account, right? Then no knowledge means that you have no idea about your trial-to-trial, item-to-item level of encoding precision. So this is a flat line. And then the limited is somewhere in between. It's something that I never tested before, but it's one in which you have either 0 or some constant value. So you think that it's essentially sort of a threshold model where if the encoding noise is low enough, you behave as if there is no encoding noise, and if it's larger than that threshold, then you behave as if it has a particular constant value. What you see here is a model comparison. So I'm not showing you here the fits of those other models. I'm just showing you a summary that is a measure of the goodness of fit. LLCV stands for cross-validated log likelihood, right? So that is if you do maximum likelihood estimation on a model, but then you cross-validate it on left-out data, right? That's a good way to prevent against overfitting. So this is relative to the known model. So the known model is at 0, and then you see that for most participants, individual dots, the known model is the best. Okay, so this gives us some confidence that people actually can track their memory precision and use that kind of knowledge in a subsequent reward-based decision. Moving on to the von Mises condition. So this is the condition where the stimulus distribution has a mean and a variance, and people are trained extensively what those are. So if you have a prior like that, what would you expect? First of all, you would expect that estimates are going to be biased towards the mean of the prior. So here, the mean of the prior is set to 0 in panel A. And if the stimulus is negative, then the error tends to be positive. So that means a bias towards the mean of the prior. And on the positive side, it's the opposite, so a negative bias. Okay, so that's encouraging. That's a signature of Bayesian inference with a prior. Panel B shows that as arc size increases, so as presumably uncertainty increases, the shift towards the prior mean is larger. That's another prediction of the Bayesian model, that if you're more uncertain, in this case about your memory, then you're going to be more influenced by the prior. Then panel C and D are a very detailed investigation of whether the prior is, to what extent the prior is used, and also whether there are particular lapse trials. So lapse trials would be where you just would make a random response. And we have different ways of modeling lapses where you would randomly pick an arc size. And the outcome of those, so we are then splitting out the lapse trials and the non-lapse trials. And in principle, you could use a prior for lapse trials because you can draw from the prior if you're really guessing. So there are many different combinations of whether the prior is used in these different kinds of trials, with many variants that I'm not going to bore you with right now. The overarching conclusion is that the model in which the prior is used on both kinds of trials, the lapse trials and the non-lapse trials, does seem to be the best model overall. However, there is some zero crossing here in the no-yes model, so where it is used in non-lapse trials, but not used in non-lapse trials, but it is used in lapse trials, right? But you could argue with this conclusion, but if you do the statistics at the group level, then the yes-yes model still wins. Regardless of the model comparison, the statistical trends that you see in A and B are independent of that. So those are the indications that the prior is used to some extent. We also examine variants where in spite of all our efforts, you haven't correctly learned the stimulus distribution. So then you might have that is slightly different from the true stimulus distribution. For example, a hormesis that's narrower or wider than the one that we train you on. But those don't change our conclusions. Okay, so that pretty much concludes the discussion of the paper. So how we think about this is that this is a pretty convincing demonstration that uncertainty is encoded in working memory, is used in subsequent decisions. Uncertainty is not just, fluctuations in uncertainty are not just due to the stimulus or to other stimulus-related factors. People seem to be pretty good in using a memory-based posterior for this reward-based decision, right? Because our utility-based model seems to be doing a pretty good job in fitting the data. Now, if people want to continue on in this line of work, I think that there is quite a bit to do in terms of combining working memory with reward-based decisions. This is a relatively unexplored direction with many other ideas that you could test. Another question is how the brain would do this at a more mechanistic level. So can you build neural models that essentially do this computation? A third question could trying to better understand where the fluctuations in precision actually come from. A final direction could be to see if any of these methods could move if, in addition to variable precision, you also have some form of capacity limit, so an item limit on the number of items that you can remember. I personally am very interested in studying working memory in displays. So we some more spatial memory. But I think I'll just stop talking now and open the floor to this. So I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves right now. And you will still have to do that if you want to speak. I'm also going to start open my chat. I see if I already got any pages there. But you can feel free to type any questions or unmute yourself and speak. If I get people speaking at the same time, I'll start asking people to raise their hand, but otherwise just go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Do you mind if I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead and maybe state your name in advance.
Hi, my name's Harrison. I have a question about the conversion from color space to circular space, and whether or not you think there's some kind of Weber warping that could happen. Like people might be very good at detecting the differences between two small arcs, but then if you had two large arcs, they'd have different sensitivity, and how you think that would, I guess that would just be like heteroscedicity in your fit.
Yeah.
Do you think that could introduce a bias? Because I'm looking at figure 3C and it looks like they are a little negatively biased, and what kind of contributions you think produce those kinds of biases, and whether
I'm aware of Tim Brady's on the role of potential role of Weber's law in working memory, and I think that is very. I don't think it's contradictory to anything we're saying here. I imagine that what would be happening there is that if you're comparing color either way, it has intrinsically more noise in that comparison. Yeah, the implications are not entirely clear to me. So it would be one in which, as you're trying to set the arc, you would be making you would essentially be introducing more and more uncertainty, as you said, bigger arcs. So yeah, that's not a mechanism that we currently have. Yeah, I would have to think a little bit more about it. It could be interesting to test that. Thank you. Yeah. All right, I see a question in the chat. Wow is saying, how much of these findings would you expect to see if only one item was used? Uncertainty could be a short stimulus presentation period, for example. I think it will be similar. I do think that some of the origin of variable precision, and this is also related to Darrell's 2012 Nature Communications paper, is associated with having more than one stimulus. So if, for example, you have multiple stimuli and you ask people report the best, then actually substantially better than if you just randomly give them one. That might have to do with fluctuations in the location of your covert attention, for example, or more generally failures to exactly distribute your attention equally. So I think that variations in encoding precision, which we're using in this paper as the driver of fluctuations and uncertainty, are possible for a single item, but just harder to detect. That would be my guess. And it's not necessarily about the magnitude of the uncertainty. We are actually looking for a wide range of uncertainty, that there are certain trials where the memory is really certain and other trials in which it's very uncertain. And Darrell is building on that. Arguments against variance arising from unequal allocation to items is that you typically don't see negative correlations between items. Okay, yeah. I'm going to unmute Darrell. You can just, okay, maybe you have to unmute yourself if you want. Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. More questions? Mingbo, hi Mingbo. In the model of known encoding uncertainty, is the memory uncertainty always on encoding noise variance? Or should it be larger than encoding noise since you don't always know the source of all noise? Interesting. As far as remember, we have only done the former. So we've only tied the level of memory uncertainty directly to the level of variance in the noise. Darrell, I believe that's correct.
Well, so I'm not sure I understand the question. Is it asking, are we allowing it's a free parameter, right? The prior, right? Is that the?
So I think it's about the
Oh,
variance.
the variance. Oh, okay.
Of associated.
Yeah, so that's not something that we have free to vary. We could. I don't. There's just so many moving parts. I don't think it would matter all that much.
Yeah. Conrad is asking, to which level is uncertainty special? If I remember something I might store, that it is big or red or uncertain color. Right. I find that I don't completely understand that question, but I would imagine that it could be that uncertainty is special because there is a prescribed way in which the observer should be using decision in a decision model, in an optimal decision model, right? So if it's big or it's red, you still have to turn that in leaf that then gets used, right? So I wouldn't say that uncertainty is just another feature. So it's true that in many experiments, uncertainty is manipulated using a stimulus feature such as contrast or motion coherence or presentation time. But in a way, we're actually moving away from that in this paper, right? Because we are doing our best to ensure that this uncertainty is internally driven. It's not associated with a stimulus feature, yet it would propagate to your decision stage, and then an optimal observer should be using that information in a particular way. And if it's big or red, then yeah, I still don't know how to use that information. That depends on the decision model. Robert, you suggested that prior uncertainty is represented in working memory. It seems more plausible to start in long-term memory. Okay, sorry if I was confusing about that. Yeah, if I was confusing about that, I did not mean to say that the prior uncertainty is represented in working memory. What we're saying is that the likelihood uncertainty essentially is represented in working memory. So this is the uncertainty that's associated with the color that you actually observe. Right? So that means that you carry that across the delay period. But the prior uncertainty, we would sure hope that that information is stored in long-term memory, right? Everything that we're doing, like the training in the beginning and then intermittent refresher of that training is aimed to store that in long-term memory.
Yeah, so given that it's constant through the whole experiment, it's probably in long-term memory. I don't think it has to be like, so you would probably get similar things if you change the prior on a trial-by-trial basis. I've done some of that in work in my lab. You can change the prior at decision stage in a trial-by-trial basis, and people do the sort of same kind of thing.
Yeah, and related to that, Luigi Acerbi also has a paper where he changed the prior on a trial-by-trial basis in 2014, I believe, with Vijay and Kumar. Danny is raising their hand. Danny?
Hey, I've just
Hi.
unmuted myself. Can everybody hear me? Yep, we're good.
Yes.
Hi, firstly, thank you for organizing this and presenting this. This is great. I wanted to ask some questions about color space, particularly relating back to the Bayatel 2014 and 2015 papers. So you folks have a fairly high saturation. So you're at 59 radius. And I think Berdal found that they could only get up to 38 without hitting the gamut of their color space. I just wanted to ask how, whether you're using a wide gamut display or kind of how careful you were about that kind of thing.
Yeah, so to be honest, probably not very careful. We weren't as careful as a color vision scientist would be. In our hands, sorry, I would say in my lab and probably also Daryl's lab, the details of that color space don't matter very much at the level of our questions. So, for example, we are not looking very much into, there might be a supplementary figure about that. We're not looking too much into the specific effects. So how uncertainty changes of color, for example. I would be slightly disturbed if it were to matter a lot, but it might. Feel free to prove me wrong on that.
I think you're probably right. It probably doesn't matter, but there's a slim chance that it matters a lot. It's one of those kind of things. So maybe we'll talk offline about that.
Sorry, was the question about converting the color space into RGB or something like that? Was that?
That's part of it. Yeah, just making sure that you're not trying to request colors that are outside of your display gamut.
They're not.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer.
yeah, that is the simpler answer, right? The entire color circle was,
Yeah, the conversion from lab to RGB depends on what white point you use, and it gets very technical. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that offline.
Cool.
John, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to follow up with a quick question. So related to the Berdal 2015 paper. So you folks did the shuffling, which I thought was a nice way to approach that. But I was wondering if you reproduced their analysis to see whether there were any category effects. You kind of, I feel like you approached the question to make sure how do we make sure that the category effects don't mess up our main conclusion?
Yeah, no, so we absolutely have looked at that, and I remember the plot. I don't know if it made it into the paper. Daryl, do you? I don't see it in the supplement right now.
No, it's not in the supplement.
Weak around the diagonal. I would say it wasn't super strong in our hands. Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. John is saying, did you consider a prior that has leak, as in encoding noise, increased memory uncertainty, flattens, i.e. not perfectly linear? Coding noise increases memory uncertainty, flattens. Yeah, so I'm not sure how to parse this question exactly, but especially because the prior and encoding, yes, would be great if you could elaborate a little.
Clarify. So it's just that in your model with the higher level of uncertainty, the model doesn't fit as well. And generally people have, after a certain level of uncertainty, all seems the same. So when you get to the very, very highest level, like a 90-degree arc is the same as a 120-degree arc because there's no difference. And to do that as a plier, like you could say a sigmoid, but you could just have a second slope at much higher values, for example, you know?
Yeah. So to some extent, we are accounting for that because the utility function is going to have a very low slope when you get to that large arcs. So that means that if you have some kind of softmax, which we do, we have a softmax readout of the utility, then the larger arcs are going to be pretty much randomly drawn from. So there's not going to be a large difference in probability between choosing a 90-degree versus 120-degree arc. Now, of course, it's still going to be a small probability relative to the better arcs most of the time. But yeah, we do have a mechanism where, in situations of very high uncertainty, we have larger tolerance to fluctuations in the arc size. That automatically comes from the model. In addition to that, we have this lapse mechanism where there's just no memory information at all, and you just have to make a random decision. Harrison is raising their hand, but I think Harrison.
Well, just to double check so I can confirm it. How does your arc size policy change as the amount of money at stake changes?
So the amount of money is linearly decreasing with arc size. So you get 100 points if you set an arc size of 1 degree, and you get 0 points if it's 180 degrees.
Totally. If I change that slope of how much my money drops off, or I start with 200 points instead of 100 points, how does that change my mapping from my posterior to my arc size?
So if you just scale it vertically, it shouldn't matter at all, right? Because the 100 is just arbitrary. If you change the slope, so you make it fall off faster or slower, then it should absolutely change your policy that you should set different arc sizes for the same level of uncertainty. We haven't manipulated that. I think it would be one of those follow-ups that would be super interesting. Right? Like we honestly haven't worked very much on the reward side in this study, but there's a lot that you could do.
Just to say that might be interesting because if there was more money at stake, I might expect that a cognitive control system would enhance encoding precision if people have control over controlling encoding precision. You know, you've been kind of agnostic to where people control, if they just control the response strategy, or if they encode the encoding process, that might be.
Yeah, so Ronald van den Berg has looked at this. I have a paper with him right now that's under review, and he also has a paper himself that just came out last year. Several other groups have also looked at the effect of reward on working memory precision. Zhang and Luck had an early paper, I think around 2010, looking at changes in the reward scheme. Overall reward in our hands, we haven't gotten that to work, even if you have a pretty large multiplier. But this was all on with online, and maybe there are other issues. So I'm not 100% sure about that yet, but we have tried it.
Okay, cool.
Does reward history influence working memory uncertainty? Pierre has asked, for example, are individuals more accurate after unrewarded trials? I don't remember looking at that.
I don't remember looking at that either. I imagine probably, but I don't know if we looked at that. We could.
Yeah, no. If you just take any error-based learning mechanism, then definitely that's what you would expect. I think that sounds like a very interesting project if you want to pick that up. That's that's just a really interesting hypothesis. Yeah. Gabriella is asking, confidence on a single trial was found to affect the threshold of subsequent trials in distribution models of dot motion task. Do you have a similar effect on your data? If so, do you think you can test which model can better explain trial to trial variation based on uncertainty of the previous trial? Yeah, so actually that's in the same category of trial sequential effects. Super interesting. We haven't looked at that at all. So I would absolutely imagine that the feedback that you're getting is going to influence your decision strategy on the next trial. For example, in terms of the precision that you set, or to the extent that you can control that, or maybe even a decision rule, which would be sort of equivalent to the threshold. I'm rambling here because I really don't know, but I think it's interesting. Yep, definitely everything is available. Feel free to play with it as much as you like. Daryl and I are happy to answer any questions by email. Going to do one more call for questions, and then we're probably going to wrap this up. All right, Alison is asking, was it necessary to train participants in the prior? If I understand correctly, it looks like your model incorporates the prior in the decision rather than the perception. So could you just explicitly tell participants to get the prior and get the same result? Okay. Yeah, so since the prior was such an important part here in probing working memory uncertainty, we sort of went overboard in trying to make sure that people actually learned it. So usually we do only one of the things that I mentioned to you, and explicitly telling people the prior sometimes works, but we generally like verbal information is a little bit vague, right? So it's always nicer to also see the prior in action, for example, through these samples, and therefore we thought that we just double up on it, right? So just to make sure that and there's no misunderstandings about the prior, and any fuzziness in their understanding gets cleared up along the way. If you are particularly interested in how people acquire priors, then that's, I would say, an entire PhD by itself, right? So you could definitely see which of those manipulations is more effective than which other ones in what conditions.
Yeah, so,
Benjamin.
I don't think it probably would have much of an effect at all, because just based on other work I've done, I mean, that was kind of our assumption, right? Is that we want to make sure that people know the prior as best as possible. It wasn't like we did pilot work to see all these stages are necessary. It was just like, this is the best way for them to, that we can be confident that they've encoded the prior. But surprisingly, some work I've done with one of my postdocs, we've given them the post like a prior at response or at perception, and there's a subtle effect, but it's pretty close. And I imagine for the bulk of the effects that we get, we could probably just do it at decision, and we'd probably get the same results. And it's worth pointing out that people didn't encode the correct prior. They actually thought it was tighter than what it really was. So when we fit it with the actual prior, people did worse. So people don't fully learn the prior even with all this training.
And another part of the answer could be that actually interesting to see whether the timing of the presenting prior information matters, right? So if you go with Daryl's design of changing prior on a trial-by-trial basis, you can manipulate when you present that information. And superficially, you think it shouldn't matter, but if you present it beforehand, in principle, you could get some efficient encoding where the brain allocates its resources, its encoding resources to the colors that it expects most. It would be sort of a use of the prior, both in terms of the encoding model and in terms of the decision. I think it's a question to take is Benjamin's more speculative question. Benjamin, are you still
Okay,
there?
I should be unmuted, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I mean, thank you. I want to reiterate what everyone else is saying. Thank you so much for doing this. Feels like we're getting a little, with Neuromatch this week and this, it feels like we're getting a bit of a glimpse of the future. With that said, I want to take this opportunity to hear you speculate a little bit. In your discussion, you sort of invoke probabilistic population coding as a potential, if you want to call it a mechanism or like a lower level way that this could be implemented. And at the beginning of this session, you also sort of contrasted what you're doing with an attractor framework. I just wanted to hear, like, how do you think that probabilistic population coding could, you know, persist over the time without an explicit stimulus like people attribute to working memory? Or how do you think that works, I guess, is my question.
It's a great idea. So it's a great question. So attractor dynamics in sort of their standard form, they just maintain a point estimate. So it's located in a particular part in your stimulus space. It has a population activity, has a particular width, but that width is not related to uncertainty. Now, people such as Sagbin Lim have been trying to also encode uncertainty in such an attractor model. So I'm not, that's impossible. It's just something that hasn't been tried as much. Maybe papers such as this can encourage neuromodelers to think in that direction. Now, in terms of population coding, of course, you have the question of how you actually, what are the mechanisms of maintenance? I don't have a whole lot to say about that. So we have one paper with Emin Orhan where we're contrasting persistent activity in the classic sense, just a single neuron that fires over a delay period, with sequential activity. So this is like Chris Harvey has sort of proposed this where your bump of activity around and you would get a sequential encoding of your memory. So there's the part of how the population activity is maintained, but if it's not an attractor, then there's also many ways in which you can encode, keep encoding uncertainty. So another paper with, in that same paper with Emin Orhan, we also do change detection task, and we know that keeping uncertainty over the delay period is also important in change detection. So one look at how exactly uncertainty is maintained there. I would imagine that you could do that either through classic sequential activity or through, classic persistent activity or through sequential activity.
Because,
and then, yeah, go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, for probabilistic population coding, as I've seen it, it's dependent on like firing rate.
Yeah.
Which to me means if you are explicitly representing this uncertainty in a working memory context, you need to maintain firing rates over the delay period. No? But
so that's right, and that's done both in the persistent and the sequential. And so if very roughly you use the totals in your population as a measure of certainty, which is sort of a very simple form of population coding, then you can do it in the persistent scheme, and you can do it in sequential. But I definitely think there's more work to be done there, right? So I think that the first place I would look is for the Orhan paper. About, and then maybe other people have other suggestions. Okay.
Thanks.
We've gone for an hour, so I'd like to wrap up, but just maybe a quick round of feedback. Raise your hand if you like this enough that you would attend a session of this type. Okay, good. So my talking has completely turned you off from this model. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming. This was a lot of fun. Stay healthy, stay safe, and let us know if you want to talk more about work. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.